This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Petra Wend, Professor Emerita and former Principal and Vice-Chancellor at Queen Margaret University, Chair of the University Council of the University of Hamburg, and now Studiosity Academic Advisory Board member. Welcome.
I'm speaking today to Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, who is Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Glasgow University in Scotland. But Anton is not only a Principal and Vice-Chancellor, he's also a world-renowned economist. And he was knighted for his services to economics and higher education in 2017. And I think you've also chaired masses of meetings, committees that deal with economics, political issues in Scotland, in the UK, in Europe, and so on. So thank you very much for making the time, Anton, to be with me today.
It's a pleasure, Petra. Nice to see you again, and nice to talk about education and again.
Yes, this is what it's about. You were asked to bring an object along that means something to you. What did you bring along today?
Well, rather boringly, it's a book, and it's actually one of a set of 2 or 3 books that I've kept because they explain why I got into economics. This book, which I dug out of my library last night, is John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash of 1929, which I bought before I started studying economics at university. And actually it was together with 1 or 2 other Penguin books at the time, one on inflation. And they kind of persuaded me it was these books that told me that perhaps I should be interested in economics because they talk about, well, in this case, it talks about obviously a really, the prelude to the Great Depression and a really bad period of economic crisis. But the other books, the other book, which I could have brought alongside with a partner, was talking about inflation and unemployment in the 1970s, and of course another period of crisis, which in a sense explains why I got interested in economics when I started my undergraduate career.
So how old were you when you read this book?
So I was 17 at the time when I read this book, and I'd left school already. Actually, I've left school probably slightly early. I'd actually intended, but I hadn't started to study economics. I'd actually started to study physics at university. And at school, I'd always been interested in the sciences. I hadn't read anything, which is why this book is significant. And in a sense, I hadn't really read, well, I read a bit. Like most people, I was interested in reading around, but I hadn't got into economics. I didn't really understand economics. But it was books like this one, and as I said, a book called Inflation by Jim Trevithick, which came out at a similar time, which persuaded me that actually I should be interested in economics, perhaps, and not as much in hard science.
Great. Well, economics is more social sciences as well, isn't it? Which is far more difficult, I think.
Yes, and it's much more uncertain and much more fuzzy. And although we as economists like to think that we use scientific methods, and we do, and we use a lot of technical sort of apparatus which many scientists use. Of course, we're applying it in a non-experimental way, which creates much more uncertainty in what we say.
You earlier mentioned school. Maybe we can, because we're talking about education, if we start with school. So what was school like for you?
Oh, school was very varied for me. I mean, partly because we moved around Europe because of my dad's job. He was latterly a managing director of a shipping company. I, at the age of 4, actually moved to the Netherlands and did all my primary education there. So I had this, native language is Italian because that's what we spoke at home. But I then went to a Dutch-speaking state primary school there. We then had a slightly turbulent interlude because the plan was to move to the UK at that point, but that was exactly when there was quite a lot of economic disruption in the UK around the 3-day week and inflation in the 1973-74. So I moved to Italy. My family decided to go to Italy, and I studied there for a year in Italy. So I had the experience of being in a lower secondary school in Italy for a year, and then I came to the UK as in sort of a secondary school there. So it was an interesting school for me. Was across three different countries in Europe with very different cultures and styles.
Exactly. So, and that was my question. It wasn't only the languages; it's different systems, different cultures. Also different expectations when it comes to achievement in school and what is important or not. How did you cope with that?
I think like a lot of kids, it's easier when the younger you are. I think when I moved to the UK, I probably found that a bit more difficult. Although the language, obviously English was, having lived in the Netherlands, English is actually there subliminally. Anyway, I didn't speak English when I came to the UK, but I ended up learning it pretty quickly, partly, I suspect, because, as I say, in the Netherlands, you're watching television and English is there. Like a lot of small European countries, you actually pick up English, even though you don't know you're picking it up. So I suppose different systems. So moving from a rather informal educational system in the Netherlands, which was actually really, I think, very formative because it encouraged you to speak as pupils. You're in at least my school. You were encouraged to intervene, to discuss even contemporary issues. So very, very liberating in that regard, into much more formal educational system, certainly in the UK, which was excellent in terms of the schooling, but much more, we're here to teach you. And so I think the balance was great. I think it gives you the balance that you probably need to then go on to university. So but as I said, interestingly, I got very much into science when I was at school, although I did enjoy other subjects of languages, obviously, but also laterally got much more into what you might call the arts, humanities, and social sciences. I enjoyed English as well, English literature, but also literature and other languages. So I suspect that although I was veering into science, I already had sort of an inkling that perhaps that's not where I might end up.
Do you still speak Dutch?
Oh gosh, I'm not a fluent speaker anymore. I can still read it. If you give me a Dutch newspaper, I can get through it reasonably well. It's funny when you learn a language. I'm not a linguistics expert at all, a languages expert, but clearly when you learn it at a very young age, it's hardwired and doesn't really disappear. So even though I don't really speak Dutch, if you give me, as I say, a Dutch newspaper or a Dutch book, I can certainly wade my way through it, which is interesting.
So what do you think about the importance of languages then?
Oh, I'm a great believer in multilingualism, to be honest, and not just because I've had this experience, but I know that even teaching students who are multilingual because they've had experience of different countries, or even within a country with minority languages, I think it's a great way to learn to think in different ways, but also clearly, as we know, it makes you culturally much more sensitive. I don't think you can really understand other cultures unless you really begin to understand the language and other dimensions of it. So for me, I think it's really important. In fact, one of the things that makes me sad around the UK, and it's nothing to do with current politics, really, it's a trend, is that it's increasingly turned away from modern languages. It doesn't matter what language it is. It could be a minority language. It could be Welsh or Gaelic, or it doesn't have to be. But modern European languages, certainly, which were certainly much more commonly studied at school, and now you're finding that universities struggle to recruit as many students. I think it's a real pity. I think multilingualism is one of the great assets you can instill in school children. Yeah, you're a linguist. You might agree.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you, Anton. I absolutely agree. This is also why I asked the question, because when I speak to British people in particular, very often they don't quite see the necessity of foreign languages, with the argument, being everybody speaks English, so it's not necessary. But what it means. Speaking foreign languages means having all kinds of transferable skills and different ways of thinking, and in your brain is wired in a different way. So comparing school systems again, in Italy, like in Germany, it's compulsory to study a certain amount of subjects up to the equivalent of A level. So far more than maybe in England, the 3 subjects, or the highest in Scotland are a few more than that. Do you think it's right to specialize that early, like in the UK?
It's a really fascinating question, Petra, and it's something I've often thought about. And of course, my experience of Italy was limited, so I didn't have. But obviously, I know it's a system I know well because of my own background and the fact that I interact with a lot of students who have been to high school in Italy. I think there is an advantage in a broad education. I think, when you see students who where some subjects like mathematics or the national language and Italian, obviously in Italy's case, is studied by everybody as pretty much in every school setting, I think is really quite important. I think, basic skills like numeracy and literacy are key. And I do sometimes think that our systems, even the more narrow English system or the slightly broader Scottish system, perhaps lose some of that important breadth by forcing people to specialize. And I mean, it's partly our systems which try, where, as you say, you do qualifications by subject as opposed to qualifications by, school qualification, like a baccalaureate or a final school exams, forces us in that direction. And I think that's a pity in many respects. Now, the trade-off is, of course, that our students who are educated in the UK, who come to university, have much deeper knowledge and much more specialized knowledge, and find the transition to study certain subjects at university. And let's remember, it's only certain subjects for whom Highers or A levels are prerequisites anyway, so it's not everybody. But, for those subjects, clearly it makes the transition much easier, and it allows them to perhaps go a bit deeper. I have to say, I suspect that drive, which was the original drive towards maintaining a narrower system, is probably waning, actually, because increasingly we're certainly finding that when we have European students, say, coming to study in the UK who haven't had that depth, perhaps in the individual subjects, they perform just as well. They quickly get up to speed. So I'm becoming more and more convinced that really a broader system is better, but it's going to be difficult to try and reform the UK system completely.
Yeah. You talked about university earlier. So what was your university experience like?
Well, as I said, I had a bit of a change of heart after year one. Actually, I initially started studying physics. I actually went to Imperial College, but dropped out pretty quickly as I changed my mind as to what I wanted to study. I then came up to Glasgow because at that stage, Imperial didn't have the option to study economics. I was determined that I wanted to do something a bit, more like economics. And I came to Glasgow because that was at that stage my hometown. And my parents lived there, although they retired back to Italy a couple of years after I moved back up. It was I studied at Glasgow, so I'm Vice-Chancellor of my sort of alma mater, which is we might come back to it. It's actually it's a real pleasure and it's a real privilege. But it was a very good university experience. I really enjoyed, obviously, studying economics. I eventually sort of took it up as a profession, but I really enjoyed the breadth of the Scottish system, which allows you to choose other subjects. For instance, in year one, alongside economics, I was able to choose a subject I hadn't studied before, economic history. Now, although it connected to economic and social history is a very, opened my eyes. I never studied history at school, actually, in the UK. I specialized in sciences. And so, it gives you a totally different perspective. And I'm sure it's also influenced the way I think about economics as well. So So again, even in that case, a broader university four-year degree was one I really benefited from in Scotland, which then allowed me to specialise quite deeply in economics, but also gave me this opportunity to do other things.
And was there something in your undergraduate degree which you had wished was different to what it was? Anything that could have been better? Did you feel well supported?
It's difficult. I mean, it's a very different experience. Obviously, much smaller numbers in the early 80s going to universities. But I think, well, let me give you a positive slant. I mean, what I see now in not only my own university, but across all UK universities is some fantastic sort of innovation and pedagogy, using modern technology to teach, away from the, chalk and talk and the formal lecture, with much more learning in groups. I mean, that I think is fantastic. And that wasn't there clearly in the early 80s. And I suppose I look with a bit of envy at our current generations, because although there are many other pressures, and I'm sure there's things that are not as good now because of, external economic factors perhaps, but in terms of education, I think what we offer now in higher education is just so much more diverse, and it gives you those great experiences. But look, it was a great experience, and I also, I had an opportunity to do the usual social engagement as well, playing sports, involved in some student society. So it was a great experience. But I suppose if I look back and say, I wish we had some of them, the sort of opportunities where international travel and opportunities have secondments in other institutions, something which was very rare in those days at the undergraduate level.
I can imagine. You then went on to postgraduate.
Yes, and it's a very, to be honest, it wasn't a very typical route to postgraduate study. I left, actually, university like a lot of students, got a job in the private sector. And literally, it was one of those sliding door moments a few months after I'd left, where I had done well in my undergraduate studies. I had done very well in my undergraduate studies, particularly my final exams. I got this phone call from my department here my former department, saying that they were about to advertise a kind of teaching assistantship for 1 year, and would I be interested in applying? And I must say, I pretty much took the decision instantly that I would apply, even though it was I was leaving a secure graduate traineeship to move into a rather insecure one-year job. And it was a slightly crazy notion, because, of course, it wouldn't pass the muster these days in terms of the doctoral training centres and programs that we have that are very, this was literally, here you are, start teaching, here's some classes, and by the way, you'll think about doing some research, won't you? Now, luckily for me, the 1 year lectureship was renewed, and after a couple of years, I started getting seriously into research. I did think, and my colleagues, to be fair, were very supportive. I did think about actually leaving at that point and going for a formal PhD doctoral program. Actually, I applied for a couple in the US, and there were good connections. And I probably, well, in fact, I was going to get 2 offers in good schools in the US, top schools. And I do sometimes wonder, another sliding door moment, what if I'd chosen to do that as opposed to simply continue my year after year teaching assistantship, doing a PhD on the side. But in the end, it obviously worked out for me.
There's so many sliding door moments in life, aren't there? And I'm a firm believer that whatever decision you take will be the right one, because you make it the right one.
I think I agree, Petra. I think it's easy to say that, of course, in retrospect, but I think that's right. I think there's this Scottish saying, "What's for you won't go by you," which I suppose means exactly the same thing. It's exactly that. I think it's you make it what you want. But of course, you sometimes do wonder what would it have been like if I'd been sitting, in a class at UCLA, a doctoral class at UCLA or MIT or similar, and where would I be? I would probably be somewhere else. I'd be in the States, probably doing economics somewhere, or maybe not. Who knows?
So when you started as a teaching assistant, started with research, were you one of a peer of people, or did you sort of have to fight very much on your own?
I was on my own, in the sense that I was the only one who was there with, there was only a couple of junior posts at that stage, and there weren't that many, if anything. Of course, that was a period of crisis in UK higher education where resources were shrinking. So if anything, numbers were going down in terms of staffing, and there was only a couple of us, but the other young lecturers all had PhDs and were more established. So I was in a rather odd position, and I'll be honest. I did struggle at the beginning to formulate a research. Effectively, I had an undergraduate education. Now, I know that is very much still, that was the British tradition, of course, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, perhaps even then started changing that, especially in many subjects. You would simply do your undergraduate and then you were ready for research. But of course you weren't, because there were people, there was formal training programs and great master's programs in top institutions that would give you the tools. And I had to build those tools myself with the help of some of my colleagues. And my colleagues were very generous with their time, and that was helpful. But then, I would say it probably took me well into year 2 to start saying, right, this is what I want to do in terms of my research. But it then took off reasonably quickly, because I actually started publishing papers before I actually did finish my PhD. And so my PhD then actually was relatively easy to write in many respects, because I'd already published 3 or 4 papers by the time the PhD was finished. So the PhD ended up being almost a collection of papers plus some other things, which again is a lot of students asked me when I was their supervisor, undergraduate level, can you give me some advice from your own career on how to enter academia? I said, for goodness sake, don't follow my career. It's a really, really bad example of how you to go into postgraduate study and then do it. I mean, it's very typical now, and I wouldn't advise anybody to follow. Well, I don't think you could. I don't think it would happen these days.
So you moved from being an educator to eventually becoming a leader, vice-chancellor, principal, and so on. But if we start or stay with educator, so what has been important to you as an educator?
It's a really good question, Petra, and I often reflect, because actually the education side, the teaching side, is one thing I really liked from day one. Actually, I think some of this is a bit trite, but I think I think it still applies. I think it's the ability to, when you're teaching your discipline, to see that kind of bond which forms between you and a student when you convey some key concepts, and then you hear them, coming back to you, and you feel that connection, that communication is there, and you feel it makes a difference. And I mean, and I have to be honest, one of the things I most enjoy now still is, and I've had that experience even last week, you meet people who were your undergraduate students, perhaps you were in your tutorial group, and you were doing, covering topics that are close to my own interest, and they say that they really enjoyed it, and they're using it. They're using it. I mean, some, of course, they're working in the private sector in banking or finance, or we're working in, but they're still using some of these thoughts and concepts. So you feel as if you've communicated and imparted skills that are genuinely useful to them. Not, of course, it's important for it to be useful for its own sake, but they are genuinely value the education they got. So for me as an educator, it's that service part, that the ability that, that gift you're given to be able to convey those skills and that knowledge, and then for that to be seen in action. I think it's really great. And beyond that, I think, seeing ways. I mean, I got great pleasure. I actually managed to write a textbook very early in my career, which again is something you should never do, apparently. But I was involved by a couple of colleagues to write a textbook when I was 25, 26, which is really not a very good thing. As I say, normally you would do that later. But again, I got real pleasure in trying to basically synthesize knowledge in a way that you can then convey, hopefully, in a more manageable way for a reader that's not a specialist reader. And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy that. And in fact, had I stayed, had I not gone into management or administration, I suspect I would have spent quite a bit of time doing things like that, writing materials or books, textbooks because it's something I really enjoy.
And were there other events or opportunities that you took advantage of, and that there were then fundamental to the ideas you enacted upon?
Yeah, I was given a lot of opportunities. I think the big, in terms of research, the biggest opportunities I was given is that that stage in the mid '80s. A new head of department took over, who took one of the sort of major chairs in the department, who basically had great international connections. So the opportunity I was given there through that leadership that was very enlightened and trying to encourage us to do sort of things we discuss these days about the importance of international connectivity in research for early career academics. I was given those opportunities. I was able to go and co-present and co-author papers and co-present them at top international conferences and that was really energizing. I suspect it's probably what kept me in the sector, if I must confess, because I think it was that you making a contribution. And that's the kind of mentoring, again, which is so important from those who are in professorial and leading position. I mean, I learned that pretty early, that you really, that is an important role that professors play, particularly in academic disciplines. So that's a key moment on that front. And then there's other kind of key moments that push me into management as well.
Well, now you're in management, you're a Vice-Chancellor and Principal. So what is important to you as a Vice-Chancellor and Principal? It's a very wide question. You probably can talk for an hour now. But
yeah. Well, I like to use I know some people use various analogies. Some people use the orchestra director analogy. I like football like you, Petra, so I use the football manager analogy. You clearly, you step back from frontline academia and your own interests, and that is frustrating in many respects. But I think the one thing I really enjoy is seeing the success of your various academic disciplines. And we've been fortunate in Glasgow that we've seen quite a few successes in that regard in terms of our research, for instance, but also many other dimensions in terms of the teaching experience and also our international connections. But the pleasure you get is effectively like that of a football manager watching people, the experts on the pitch and performing well. So that's the bit I suppose I for me is really important. It's getting huge pride from the achievements of colleagues, and it doesn't matter what discipline. I also have to say, I suppose as somebody who has been interested in the science, the arts and humanities and social sciences, I think it's a great privilege to be in a university where there's that breadth of disciplines, because I really enjoy. I mean, like yesterday, I was shown around our chemistry labs by the head of school. I mean, another occasion you'll speak to colleagues in modern languages or whatever, social and political science. It's really that interaction with those who are working at the chalk face is so important. To keep me motivated that what I'm doing is actually helpful or useful or in any way.
Yeah, I guess also seeing students graduate, that also brings it all back, isn't it? What universities are for as well.
Yeah, student graduating, alumni of different generations, including ones that have left recently, and tell you that, as I said, it is useful. What they got at the university was useful to them. All these things. I mean, graduation ceremony, huge empowering events, I think all these things give you a bit of a boost. I mean, obviously, as you know very well, I mean, these roles, the management roles, are difficult because they involve making difficult decisions. I mean, but then I suppose one thing about economics is we would say it's about making choices and in situations of constrained resources. That's what economics is about. And but it's not easy, because sometimes, many a time you end up having to say that you're not doing certain things, and that's not what you want to do. You'd rather be able to say yes to all the wonderful ideas that come out and wonderful initiatives that come out of universities. But ultimately, we have to make choices, which is the difficult bit of the job.
So talking about the difficult bits, what challenges do you see in the higher education sector? So not particularly only Glasgow University.
Well, I think if I look certainly to the UK, but I suspect it's actually across Europe. I mean, we've had now 2 major economic crises in the period of 3 years. First COVID, and then we're seeing the cost of living and inflation crisis, which is also fiscal crisis as well. I think it's putting tremendous pressure on the resources. And it doesn't matter whether you're a largely publicly funded system like a continental European country, or indeed in Scotland, which is more publicly funded than England, or whether you're looking at England, which puts more weight on individual contributions through the income contingent fee system, fee repayment system. It doesn't matter. We're seeing the teaching resource eroded around universities across the UK, across Europe. All the investments that we've been able to make as a sector, not only in making the student experience better by giving people support, both in the academic sphere, but also elsewhere in terms of the wider experience, also important areas like mental health, particularly post-COVID. You're seeing all those investments that are going to have to be put under pressure. So I suppose that's the bit that I find most difficult, because it's almost like a return to those 70s and 80s where the system was under pressure, and there won't, that won't be easy. It doesn't matter where you are. I suspect even okay, there are 1 or 2 European countries whose economies are in better shape, but across the board we're seeing a lot of pressure. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge. I think there are other challenges which are more positive challenges, which are to do with the challenge to the sector to really prepare our students and our graduates for what is the biggest fight ahead, which is climate change and dealing with transition to net zero, which is, universities are the key to a lot of these solutions, whether in the scientific innovation field or in the skills field. And that's more positive, because there's, an area where we need to step up to the plate, and again, across the world in this. And I do think it's a pivotal moment for us to play a role in that. So, in different ways, challenges, some difficult ones that are more negative, because it's all about making difficult choices. But the other was hopefully more about, right, what are we going to do as a society, and what can we learn from the COVID crisis, where we did all pull together at societal level to perhaps play this role on the transition to net zero and the existential crisis that is climate change, and what role do we play as institutions in that?
So do you think the UK has come out of Brexit when it comes to universities?
Has the UK come out of Brexit?
Is it done and dusted?
No, it's not done and dusted. I mean, this has had various effects, as you know. I mean, I think the UK, we are attracting less European students than we did before, especially at undergraduate level, because it is actually, it's less attractive. It tends to be less diverse, because they tend to come only from richer countries, and it's only those European students who are willing and able to pay for that higher education. So that's limiting, I think. I think it's having a really negative impact, by the way. As an economist, I know it's having a hugely negative impact on key sectors. And it's, we were able to attract incredibly talented Europeans into courses that fed key sectors, whether, it was fintech or manufacturing, and suddenly we don't have that. And of course, we've got our hugely talented home students, but as you know, I mean, we have in the UK a low productivity economy. We know that the problems of low productivity that were there before Brexit really, a part of our landscape for the last 15, 20 years, have been exacerbated by lower investment since Brexit, and probably, serious shortage of skills in key areas. And And universities were the conduit for a lot of those skills coming into the country, with young people deciding to come here at 18 and then leaving and staying in the UK. And Scotland particularly has a demographic challenge. Has had declining demography for many decades, for over 100 years, and being in the EU had partly reversed that. And now we're seeing that challenge again. So yes, no, I don't think the UK has come out of Brexit. I think there's going to be a huge national conversation, to put it positively, or let's hope it's not a national recrimination, a national conversation, I think, in the years to come, to say what exactly do we want the relationship to be, and how much have we lost by not being closer to our European neighbours.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. One I wanted to ask you is about old and new universities, because we still have that technology. At least in England, it's old and new. In Scotland, it's ancient, and so on. Or we have post-92s in England. We still talk about post-92s in England. And how many years is that ago now? Is that distinction something that is useful? Should it remain?
I don't think age per se is very useful as a label. And in fact, I mean, I keep reminding my colleagues here, we're an ancient university. I keep reminding people how few ancient universities are still amongst the world's leading universities. So you should be, very wary that age brings success without any further intervention. No, look, there's some competing tensions in there. On the one hand, I as I say, I don't like age as a label. I prefer, but I'm in favor of using labels which tell us something about what the strengths are. And so, being a modern university that focuses a lot on vocational courses that are very relevant to the labour market, well, I think that's a great thing. And I, if I were leading a new university that was focusing on being a modern, very connected university to particular key sectors, I say that's a great thing to be. And as you know, before coming back to Glasgow, I was at Heriot-Watt University as Vice-Chancellor for 3 years. That's a 1960s, 1960s university with a longer tradition, of course, of technological teaching, but much more applied than the university in Glasgow. And that's fantastic thing. So I believe in a diverse sector, actually. I really believe in a diverse sector, and I think I sometimes worry that perhaps we by talking about HE simply, if we drop these labels and we just talk about HE, then we run the risk of homogenizing. And I think this is where things like league tables homogenize too much, because it creates an attempt by some universities to try and turn themselves into something they're not. And I don't think that's right. On the other hand, I think there is a parity of esteem which is really important. It doesn't matter whether it doesn't matter whether you're a very progressive further education college or a university. If you're doing really useful things in education and tertiary education, you shouldn't be dragged down by a label in some way. You should focus on those strengths. So I wish there was more parity of esteem, even though in reality, of course, you're never going to have institutions in different parts of the spectrum which are the same. We're all different, and I think that diversity is a strength, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you. If you could change something for students now, what would it be?
Oh gosh, it's a really interesting question. I wish I could make the scars of COVID go away at the moment. I think, but that's too short term. That's not a good answer. I think what I would love to do, if I had a magic wand, is one of the things I would love to do is to really increase. And this does take resources and Brexit doesn't help this, is I would try to multiply many times the opportunities that students have to basically study across different institutions and have more dual degrees, have more international secondments and opportunities. And I think we are going to do that, and we are doing that in my own university through things like virtual opportunities for students to spend time with students in other universities. But I think it's just so important, especially at this time, given where the world is going and the challenges we face for that understanding, that transnational understanding. So that's one thing I would love to supercharge over the next few years. I think that's one of the most important things.
Great. I think I sneak one final question in, because we had exciting sort of political events in Scotland,
Yeah.
and the resignation of the First Minister. And obviously we could have a political discussion now, which wouldn't be appropriate, but there might be educational consequences, because Nicola Sturgeon has been very vocal about narrowing the attainment gap in schools. The widening participation commission we had in Scotland, having more widening participation about students from deprived backgrounds going to ancient universities and so on. Do you think this will have consequences for the educational sector in Scotland, her resignation?
I hope not, because I think, Petra, you and I were part of that Widening Access Commission, and it was really important work. And I'd like to think that this really crosses the political divide. It's no longer something which needs to have debates on. I think there's two ways in which, I think Scotland has made great strides, by the way. I think our universities have done fantastic work in widening access, and again, coming from very different positions and traditions to do that. But I think there's two areas where we need to do much more work. One of them is around what we do with early years, because we know that we've done a lot with those students who already have made the choice that education and higher education or further education might be important to them. But we still lose a lot of people in the earlier to middle years. And, one of the things we've been doing, certainly in collaboration between the Universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, is to set up inter-university centres, which are very present across the UK, to try and work with, especially with families of younger kids, and continue to raise aspirations. So I think that work is really important, because I think we've done as much as possible to pull on the other side of the pipeline. I do think we need to deal with the issues of deprivation and non-engagement with education in the early years and middle years. The other area, however, where I think we do need to do with this, I still think we need better data on issues around access. You and I were, certainly made this case during the Widening Access Commission. Using postcode data only gets you so far. It's a very rough measure of deprivation, or so I'd like us to think that we can go beyond that finally, and especially in this world of much better data, surely we can do better than this and target much more. Finally, social mobility. I mean, one of the things we've kind of focused all our attention on this, and in reality, the bigger challenge is, of course, social mobility, which is what happens to students when they graduate. We bring them to university from more deprived backgrounds, but do they then go on to get those jobs that will allow genuine social mobility? And the evidence is that it's still a huge difficulty, not only in Scotland and the UK, by the way. It's a big issue across Europe, and especially even places like the US as well, that have a much more, arguably should have a much more sort of mobile system. So so these are the areas I think we need to work on. And I hope that despite the change of leadership in Scotland, whichever political party leads, they will put an emphasis on widening access and on higher education. It's so important.
Yeah, let's hope so. I completely agree with you there, as you know. So that has always been sort of the motivation in my life and my own passion as well. So it's very good to hear that you agree, and it's also very reassuring for you to say that you hope that, or it's likely that the agenda is not going to change drastically with new leadership.
It's hope not, and we all come, you and I and many other university leaders come from generations that were first in family at university. My grandfather was a peasant farmer in southern Italy. He was an immigrant to Ellis Island even before my own immediate family became immigrants. So I mean, we all know what it's like, how empowering education is to make a difference in people's lives. So I think we just need to focus on the prize that it brings in terms of social inclusion.
These are really fitting final words from you, Anton. Thank you. Thank you. I think this brings us to the end. I think I could have chatted for ages with you and talked myself a bit more, but this was about you and not about me. So thank you, Anton, so much for your insight and for making time available to share your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Petra. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Visit studiosity.com/Students First for the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education.